Good evening, everyone. I'm Anne Mossop from the Sydney Opera House, one of the curators of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We've all got through the football moment. We've got through a lot of dangerous ideas today. This is one of the last sessions. We've got two worthy opponents who will disagree and potentially, we might allow them to agree with each other a little bit. For a very interesting topic that is going to be something that we're going to be talking about a lot in the next few years, I think. Can I just remind you to have your mobile phones on silent? Feel free to tweet if you want to. It's one of the great pleasures for people who are not in the sessions to see what people are saying and allows us to keep track of both of the arguments and the whereabouts of certain well-known troublemakers who've been sitting in the audience in various sessions tweeting away. The topic tonight, Anzac Day, Best We Forget, is something with the centenary of Anzac coming up is going to be, I think needs to be a topic of discussion so that we can think about what that historical moment is going to mean. We have two speakers today who have both written about not necessarily specifically about Anzac Day, but the whole significance and meaning of different military endeavours in Australian history. Marilyn Lake is going to speak first. She's one of Australia's most distinguished historians. She has a personal chair in history at La Trobe University. She's the president of the Australian Historical Association. She's best known for her work. She works very broadly across a range of issues: the political history of women in Australia, the impact of war and military endeavours on civil society, anti-racism and the White Australia policy, as well as writing about the history of Australia in the world. Her two most recent books, are both written with Henry Reynolds, are Drawing the Colour Line and obviously relevant tonight, What's Wrong with Anzac? The Militarisation of Australian History. Our second speaker tonight is Peter Fitzsimons, who's you would know from his regular writing in the press. Rugby player, sports journalist, incredibly prolific and popular non-fiction writer of history and also a range of biographies. He's published books including Kokoda, Tobruk, both books about different aspects of the Second World War, biographies of Charles Kingsford Smith, Nancy Wake, Kim Beazley, a series of our sporting heroes, as well as a childhood memoir, A Simpler Time, and Batavia, published in 2011. So Marilyn and Peter will both have their chance to put their arguments. We'll have plenty of time for discussion amongst ourselves and with you, and there are microphones in the audience that we'll cut to when it comes time for questions. So to speak to us first, Marilyn Lake.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a delight to be here. I'm addressing the question, Best We Forget Anzac Day. I start by quoting the American journalist David Rieff. In his provocative short book called Against Remembrance, David Rieff reminds us of the source of the words, lest we forget. It's in fact Kipling's Recessional, in which every stanza ends with the phrase repeated twice, lest we forget, which, as Rieff notes, ironically, is a recognition that in fact forgetting is inevitable, that all events will be forgotten unless action is taken to shore up historical memory. In Australia, massive federal government investment has been necessary to shore up the memory of Anzac. And that investment reached massive proportions in the last 15 years. And I just want to elaborate on that a little. And what I'm sort of asking really is, what is the justification for this massive investment of millions of dollars in this moment? I want to open my remarks, though, with a disclaimer. I have no problem, of course, as I guess most of us don't, with the commemoration of those who gave their lives in the service of their country. That used to be the point of days of remembrance, such as Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. But in the last 15 years, these commemorations have been taken over by agencies who make large historical claims now about their national significance. that our nation was born at Gallipoli in 1915 and that our national identity and values were forged in military combat, not in civil and political society as we used to think. History then has been appropriated in the service of militarist myth-making, and in the process our understanding of our national experience has been massively distorted. This concerns me, both as a historian deeply committed to Australian history and Australian history in the world, and also committed to historical accuracy. A couple of years ago, a young man from Victoria on pilgrimage at Gallipoli was asked by a journalist why he was there. This was reported in the Age newspaper. Because, he said, this is where Australian history began. Nothing happened before then, he said. Well, you know, you have to ask, what sort of history did this young man learn? I mean, what sort of history had he learnt at school? Where did he gain this historical misunderstanding? In the book I wrote with my colleagues, What's Wrong with Anzac, we devoted a chapter, chapter 6, to exactly this very question. And the title of that chapter is called How Do School Children Learn About the Spirit of Anzac? Now, readers who've read that chapter are shocked, always shocked, by the facts that we assemble there. And those facts document a systematic program of education, dare we say indoctrination, undertaken not, as you might imagine, by an education department or by historians, but by the newly formed Department of Veterans Affairs. Newly formed because it was created only in 1996 in the wake of the closure of the Repatriation Commission. Now, the original Repat Commission, as many in Australia affectionately thought of it, had actually been formed way back in 1917 to look after returned soldiers and to tend to their graves, which were often located in faraway lands. Now, it defined its objective back in 1917 as to commemorate individually the sacrifice of those Australian men and women who gave their lives during or as a result of war service, individually. Now, the Repat, as many Australians, including many of my relatives, affectionately referred to this institution, did no educational, pedagogical or propaganda work. However, with the creation of the new DVA, in the years leading up to the centenary of Federation, in the late 1990s, education became a major, if not arguably the major, purpose of this federal government department. Millions of dollars would be allocated to support its programs. There were two major programs. In 1996, one was called Their Service, Our Heritage, and its educational aim was made explicit: to educate all Australians through school-based and other programs about the service and sacrifice of Australia's veterans and, this is important, their role in developing the nation. Here's a new claim, it's a sort of new historical claim, a new historical interpretation. Now, to engineer this reconstruction of Australian historical memory, DVA announced 5 key strategies. And I think they're really interesting strategies for anyone interested in historical memory, and they reflect quite a canny understanding of how you construct historical memory. Just quickly, the first strategy was the identification of new national days of annual remembrance, because if you have continual annual remembrance of new days, this always keeps these things before us. So Anzac Day was joined by a beefed-up Remembrance Day and Battle for Australia Day and Merchant Navy Day and Vietnam Vets Day, and just recently the bombing of Darwin Day, for example. More and more days have been invented for us to commemorate. Secondly, the second strategy, to refurbish existing war memorials and to create new ones. And there's been a massive explosion of war memorial building across the country. Now, these have included efforts to include groups previously marginalised or, in fact, who were excluded from enlistment, such as women and Indigenous Australians. Then there's a new attempt to have new memorials to wars possibly forgotten, such as the Boer War, and there's a proposal for a new national Boer War memorial in Canberra. And then, and this is where, you know, it gets to be really imaginative, then new war memorials to other species. There's been a move, a widespread move, to recognise the war efforts of animals. of particularly horses and dogs. And a Queensland first was announced just this year when it was proclaimed that a new plaque was being unveiled at Robina. And this plaque was, quote, dedicated to all war animals. They also served, lest we forget. Horses, dogs, donkeys are all now called up in this sort of ritual of war commemoration. And someone said to me, but what about cats? They're brave too. The third strategy, education about significant events. Events, as you all know, are important to history. And so one of the self-conscious strategies was to name events. And of course, when you've got battles, there's a huge potential to find all sorts of new events to commemorate. You know, the battles through all the wars that Australia's been, and a huge amount of education about all of these events. And then whole years become events, you know, like 1942, not long ago, the 60th anniversary, so DVA put out curricular materials to cover the whole year. This year, it's the 70th anniversary of 1942, so the fall of Singapore is the major event. So that was events. Then the fourth strategy was education in schools, and of course this was a huge one. And massive programs enabled the provision of curriculum materials across all primary and secondary schools in Australia. Textbooks, websites, course packs, TV documentaries, posters, pilgrimages and prizes, the National History Challenge and the Simpson Prize. With the inauguration of the second program called Saluting Their Service in 2002, the focus on schools intensified, and the strategy that DVA adopted was quite unashamedly called Targeting Young People. And they would do that with a team of what they called education service providers, that is, skilled teachers who were called upon to provide quality, state-of-the-art curriculum resources. Then fifthly, community awareness campaigns. That was the fifth strategy, and that would involve lots of oral histories, you know, collecting of medals, museums, exhibitions, etc., etc. And also the digitation of the digitisation of nominal roles, so that people can now do their family history as military history, and military history has become family history because all the roles have been put online. Now, quickly, I protest against the use of taxpayer funds in the service of the rewriting of Australian history on two main grounds. First, the characterisation of Australian participation in World War I in this exercise is highly misleading. And second, our national values and identity were formed not in masculine military experience, but in fact in civil and political society by men and women who'd never been to war. Think of Barton and Deakin. Think of Curtin and Menzies. Think of Catherine Spence and Vida Goldstein. Men and women who'd never been to war. They are the architects of our sort of national democratic values. So that this notion that our values and identity were formed in militarism, in military engagements, I think is completely misleading, and also completely obscures aspects of our history that we should be proud of and know more about. Because these are the things that made Australia distinctive in the world. These are the things that earned Australians a reputation, a world-based reputation. Just quickly to come to my end, I could give you all sorts of evidence for this identification of democracy as Australia's sort of gift to the world. And interestingly, in the years between 1901, Federation, and 1914, the outbreak of war. I mean, the outbreak of war, in a way, sees the end of this very innovative, creative period. Two pieces of evidence. One is about H.B. Higgins, the president, our noble Henry Higgins, the president of the Commonwealth Court of Arbitration. He became quite famous in the world for theorising our special sort of social democracy. And many people came here to see, to talk to him and to see how it worked, and wrote lots of articles about this. And just really quickly to give you one example from a Professor Hammond from Ohio State, he talked about Higgins and said that what Higgins and his fellows, what they had done was to lay down democratic experiments that he said, quote, have drawn the eyes of the world to Australasia, and which marks the most notable experiment yet made in social democracy. The most notable experiment yet made in social democracy. And I can say a bit more about Higgins. He wrote a really interesting essay in 1902 called Australian Ideals. The other example, quickly, and I'll wind up, Percy Grainger, to move to a completely different area, music, the composition of music. Now, Percy Grainger, as you will all know, is one of Australia's best-known composers, and he thought that Australian music should reflect Australian values. And in 1915, he composed a piece called The Marching Song of Democracy. And this would be much better known. And this was in 1915, of course, the same year as Gallipoli. And the Marching Song of Democracy, he composed as a tribute to this New World democracy, but also was inspired by that other tribune of democracy in the United States, Walt Whitman. Interestingly, because he wanted it to be a tribute to democracy, it was composed for voices and whistlers only, that people had to sing it and whistle it, but there would be no sort of hierarchical musical accompaniment, and the only rhythmic accompaniment would be their tramping feet. And I think it's really interesting to conceptualise, a piece of music that is composed as being fitting to the spirit of democracy. And he said that he wanted this to express, quote, the optimistic humanitarian democracy and its urge to be heroic but not martial. Okay, I shall finish. World War I then sees the end of this dream, of this achievement, of this distinctive Australian democracy. And in fact, it seems to me completely misplaced that we, by default, as it were, land on Anzac Day as a sort of national day for several reasons. Gallipoli, of course, marks the invasion of the Ottoman Empire, which is a Muslim state. And the Ottoman Empire is invaded by the two other empires, the British and the French Empire. And Australians are only there because they're colonials. They're colonials there supporting the British Empire, just as the Indians are also there because they support the British Empire. So it's completely inappropriate, I think, that we should be commemorating this colonial condition. Finally, just to talk about that alliance of forces that were there in Gallipoli, it's quite interesting that after World War I, Turkey, of course, becomes an independent nation state when the Ottoman Empire dissolves, and India, of course, becomes an independent nation state. Now, if you look up the national days of those two countries, Turkey and India, they are both on their Independence Day. They both mark the days of the end of their colonial dependence. Sadly, we in Australia await our Independence Day still. We don't have an Independence Day. And so we are still waiting for it. There's a day there waiting for it to be filled in. And so in place of that, by default as it were, we go back to this colonial moment when we're there as colonials fighting for the British Empire. So I would suggest to you that it is hardly appropriate to take this day as our national day when in fact, as I say, we await our national independence still. Thank you.
I'll now call on Peter Fitzsimons to continue the conversation. Of course, what I forgot to mention is he is a member of the Anzac Centenary Advisory Committee.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Marilyn. And thank you, Anne. And thank you for no welcome at all. Nothing? Do I get nothing? All right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And to a certain extent, this is not a fair fight. Marilyn is an eminent historian. I want to begin by saying I am not. And I'm not even an historian. I'm mostly a storian. Okay, I tell stories. I love stories. I love a lot of parts of Australian history. What I want to say here, I speak more from the heart than from the head. I feel strongly things from the Anzac tradition because this is the subject I've had to analyse whether what I feel is right or not, and I've come to the conclusion I am right. I want to begin by saying this. I am, you are, we are Australian. Just like the song says, I came from the dreamtime, from the dusty red soil plains, I am the ancient heart, the keeper of the flames. We've got all this rich mosaic in this country, all of these stories of where we came from, And to a large extent, it is the people that decide which are the stories that resonate with us, which are the ones that make us feel emotional, which are the ones that we are proud of. I was raised on the Anzac tradition. I am proud of the fact that my grandfather fought in the Boer War, even though I don't agree with the Boer War. That knowing what I know now, feeling the way I feel now, I am totally with you. Can we have an Independence Day? Can we have a flag of our own? All of those. I'm on the board of Australian, devoted to getting Australia a flag of our own, a foreign flag off our flag. I love the line of Jerry Seinfeld when he came out to Australia in the year 2000. He said, "I love your flag, Great Britain at night." And so I believe totally in the Republic. I believe having a flag of our own, and I would love us to a certain extent. I agree with much of what Marilyn says, that there are a diversity of other stories that I would like, Australians to embrace as well. One is that I think that Australia should know a lot more about is the Myall Creek Massacre. That is an appalling story. And it would be great if more Australians could recognise what that was about. When I first started a book, I wrote the foreword and launched the book by Peter Stewart about it. And, that's something that Australia should know far more about our Indigenous history. I'd love Australia to know far more, all of us Australians, to talk about the Eureka Stockade story. There's a brilliant book actually coming out in 30 days' time. Matter of fact, I wrote it. But and I'm not going to hijack this occasion by begging you to read my books. I honestly don't care if you do or don't read my books. All I care is that you buy my books. But on the Anzac tradition, I was raised on it in the sense that born and bred about 60 miles north of here at Peach Ridge, and Dad had fought with the 2nd ACAC in North Africa, in El Alamein particularly, and then he'd gone to New Guinea. Mum had been a physio with the Australian Army, so all of their friends were around. We would go to Anzac Day. I would find it moving when my mother and my father would march on Anzac Day. They would get together with their friends. As an author, it has been my privilege to interview many of those people from the Second World War. When I'm doing Tobruk and I'm doing Kokoda, I'm talking to the men of the 2nd 13th Battalion, I'm talking to the men of the 39th Battalion. I got to say, I feel it strongly. They are a magnificent breed of people. They're terrific people of a great generation of Australians. When I go to the grave sites, so when I'm in New Guinea and I go to Bamana War Cemetery, in Athens there's the Phaleron War Cemetery, Lone Pine in Gallipoli, and Tobruk. I go to that Tobruk War Cemetery. It's not that on the Gallipoli issue, when you talk about the invasion of Gallipoli, in 1999, I remember having been raised on the whole Anzac thing, listening to the ABC, and somebody said, for the first time I ever heard them say, well, when we invaded Gallipoli, when we invaded Turkey, and I was in traffic, and I thought, what? We what? I suppose technically it was their land. But that was a revelation to me to think about that, and of course we invaded. It is not that you don't agree with the war necessarily, that you don't honour the people that fought and died there. I was extremely outspoken, and I'm very proud of how outspoken I was against the Iraq War. It was insane to have the whole Iraq War from the beginning. I was one of 500,000 people that marched against it in Sydney. Sadly, John Howard wasn't listening, whatever. But I still honour those who fell. And when Bamana War Cemetery in Phaleron and places like that, and Tobruk, and when I went to Tobruk for the first time, and you see the land that they fought and died for, and you go to that cemetery, I do think it's right that we honour those who died, those who sacrificed. When just west of Paris there, the Villas Bretonneux Cemetery, I took my 3 kids there and walked around, and they looked at the ages of the young men that died. And I'll never forget, we were going, I told them that the war was finished on the 11th of November 1918, and Jake said, Dad, 4th of November. And Louis said, Dad, 9th of November. And then my daughter found one, 18th of November. Died a week after the war was over. And is it a bad thing that I'm totally with you too when Yobbos try to take over Anzac Day? I'm totally with you. I hate the any part of the breastfeeding, and there's been an unhealthy tinge in recent times, I think, with Anzac Day, that it's become there's a bit too much breastfeeding. But generally, with Anzac Day, where did it come from? What was it about? What it was about? Well, we lost 60,000 people in that First World War. In the Battle of the Neck, we lost, on the 7th of August in 1915 at Gallipoli, we lost 400 men in about 6 minutes. And in Fromelles, 5,000 casualties, 2,340 in 24 hours. Appalling, appalling carnage. It is right that we remember those who fell, that we understand what happened. One of the things that came out of the appalling carnage of Gallipoli, it was worked out that Australian men, Australian soldiers should be under Australian command, not command of other nations. So by focusing on that, the nation moves forward. In the Second World War, who can doubt that we were on the right side of the equation? Generally, I think with all of those wars, we have been... I'm proud of the Australian military tradition. We don't have a My Lai on our record. We don't have mass atrocities on our record. Generally, we have been fighting against totalitarian regimes, and the Australian military record is a proud record. I note Marilyn's attack on governments funding institutions like ACAB, funding institutions like the Australian War Memorial or education programs. Where does that come from? We are a liberal democracy. Governments put forward proposals, people come to the election, they vote for them, they vote against it. So I don't agree that this is a malevolent force of the government saying thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt concentrate on Anzac Day at the exclusion of all other things. What it is in the late, I think it was the mid-1990s, I started taking my kids to Anzac Day ceremonies out of the blue. I don't know, the wind changed. A lot of people clearly felt the same because there was huge crowds suddenly showing up in the late 90s. And that wasn't led by the government, in my view. It was led by the people. People feeling that this actually is a valuable tradition. And I would agree with a lot of what Marilyn was saying if you could actually make the case that the whole thing was militarised, if the soldiers, the old diggers themselves, were actually doing breastbeating and marching down George Street, goose-stepping or whatever. But it's not that. It's basically a solemn occasion, and what a fabulous thing it is. The one day of the year that Australia, of all generations, look back to our history and say, this is what happened. I think it's a great gathering of the community to look at our past and our generally proud past, that we have been fighting on the right side of the wars. Anyway, many things my father taught me. The thing that I most often cite, he said to me, son, nobody ever made a bad 2-minute speech. And so I will join Marilyn on the chair, and I guess we will welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for those. We will take questions, as you get the urge and come down to the microphones. I'm very happy to take your questions. But I think there are quite a lot of interesting things there to raise. And one of which is this question about why, as a society, we choose to remember certain things. And as a historian, all of us as readers and observers of these things, there are choices being made about what we remember and how we rewrite the stories of particular historical times. Peter, you've said that you feel that there was something in the air that led people to re-engage with Anzac Day. Marilyn, you've traced it back to a particular moment. Of course, which way we answer this depends on whether we attended Sam Harris's talk on Friday night and whether we believe in free will or not. We might just put that to one side because I just think it would only complicate things. The year that you mentioned as the start of this process, the formation of that...
DVE.
Yes. 1996?
Yep.
Are we talking about... So are we, with what you're talking about, are we talking about something really led by the Howard government?
Yes, 1996 was when, a lot of you here will remember the old Repack Commission, which, as I said, was mainly there to look after people who used to be called returned soldiers. The term veterans has actually now come into Australian experience, which has been borrowed from the United States. So the Repack Commission gave way to the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the Department of Veterans Affairs from 1996, in the lead up to the centenary of Federation, was given masses of money to demonstrate military contributions to the making of the nation. And so you can document, I mean, the great thing about doing history, it's like detective work, of course. You know, you can get all these facts and figures, and you can get this story from DVA itself. Of course, its own records show all this, and so masses of stuff gets sent out to the community, to schools and whatever. So that's an interesting question, Anne, about when you say, and Peter suggested, well, it was in the air and we just felt like starting and going then. But of course, you know, historians would look at it and say, well, yes, but why? I mean, what was happening that suddenly, you know, that it was in the air for everybody, and suddenly school children, you know, start to engage, and then people often say, isn't it wonderful how the young are engaging? But of course the schools started being saturated with all this stuff, and you can actually document all that. So there was a shift, and the Howard government comes to power.
Marilyn, is it not also that with the bicentenary, a lot of us had been celebrating Australia Day without ever really focusing on the fact that it was also Invasion Day, that for the Indigenous people. So Australia Day became a difficult day to say, yeah, because it was a day of great sadness for the Indigenous people. So it's a problematic day for real, you know, I am, you are, who are we, what are we, because...
For being nationalist.
Yeah, that's right. So the problem that came with the bicentenary, the focus on that was it was a day of extraordinary sadness for the Indigenous people. So if you move off that day as saying that's our great day, well, the next obvious day is Anzac Day. And Anzac Day now. So we have, again, in this country in the 21st century, a fine, I'm sure you agree, Australian Defence Force that are doing... No, well, do you not? Do you not?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not in a position to say whether we have a fine. Our
peacekeeping force in Timor, our peacekeeping force doing great work all over the world. And so Anzac Day for them has become a day when they march.
Can I say something about that? I mean, you make a really good point about the problematic nature of Australia Day, and the context, to go back to your point, and about the election of the Howard government is really important because, of course, the larger context is the so-called history wars. And the history wars, an interesting term, metaphorical usage of war there, the history wars, which had focused on massacres in colonial Australia, John Howard literally decided to change the subject and, we could say, open up a new front. And he opened up a new front in historiography, and it's absolutely right that you had to get... He'd really lost the history wars, and you had to get away from all that stuff and focus on overseas. And this is another peculiarity, by the way, of Anzac Day and Australian engagement with its heritage, is that why does all our stuff happen overseas and not in our own country? But the context of the history wars was really important.
Because we haven't had a civil war in this country.
You don't need civil wars.
Well, we haven't had. We've had originally colonial forces.
Well, I think it's a question of more. To go back to Marilyn's point, is do we need wars for it to be historically worth remembering?
But when the Australian War Memorial puts on exhibitions, they not unnaturally, and I'm a member of the Council of the War Memorial, they put on exhibitions from Australian wars, and Australian wars have been fought overseas.
Sure, but we shouldn't make larger claims about the centrality of all that to Australian nation building. That's what I'm saying. Keep it in its place. It has its place, you know, but it's not
mighty big of your text.
It's not the whole of Australian history.
We might go to this lady here. Yes.
I'd just like to ask Marilyn, to what extent you think the glorification of past wars is a political strategy to gain public acceptance for current conflicts?
Yes, well... Great question. Yes, it's a good point, and of course a lot of people have made the point that this, if not glorification, this sort of relentless commemoration of the Anzac tradition, in which all wars are blended into one, as it were, that this serves to naturalise war. You know, that Australians are always at war, that it's quite natural for Australians to be at war. And the other point in that, which goes back to something Peter said about not criticising men and women who serve, which of course we're not criticising men and women who serve, But what happened out of Vietnam was that the anti-war demonstrators, you know, came to be seen as terribly unpatriotic, as if they were criticising the men and women who served. And so it came to look as if you couldn't criticise Australia being at war without criticising those who were going to fight. And I think we have to make that distinction, you know, that you can criticise a war and the, you know, justice or not of a war without criticising the individuals who are called on to go and serve in the armed forces. So I think it's a really good point that, yes, of course, it tends to provide a conducive background, if you like. Mm.
Hi. So is this... Okay. Hi, my name's Giacomo. This is mostly directed towards Marilyn. I'm just wondering, you talked about the idea of the formation of values in the political sphere rather than the military sphere.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's sort of a misconception or somewhat missing the point when we talk about Australian values or a corpus of Australian values, whether that's not a sort of a wrong initiative to take, because I don't really know if we can refer to a corpus of Australian values, and if we do, and if we refer to those that were created around Federation and also around the 19th and early 20th century, that those will be essentially colonial values, in the same way that it was a colonial war that we were imbued in. Well,
it's a good point. Can I say two things in response? I mean, it's a really good point, and of course I think about that all the time. I mean, to an extent, we engage with these issues strategically. And so what I'm suggesting, and I think, I actually believe it, is that to the extent that things distinguished Australian political culture, say, or Australian culture more broadly, they were values and identities formed in the civil and political society. By the way, and I also think we completely under-recognise all of those great pioneers in civil and political society, those people who fought for all these things we now take for granted. Of course it's problematic, and it's not least problematic because it rests on racial exclusion. You know, the belief in equality of opportunity that someone like Higgins spoke about rested on racial exclusion, to which I would say, well, of course democracy is always a work in progress, you know, that we always have to be working to try and extend equality of opportunity, you know, to everybody. The second point about, but aren't these colonial values too? One of the things I think is quite interesting, and some of you might or might not know about the new national history curriculum that's being rolled out across Australia, and one of the things that the authors of that curriculum emphasise, and I think rightly, or two things. First of all, is they want to emphasise political mobilisation of ordinary people, but secondly, they also want to emphasise what is distinctive, what Australians did distinctively, in the sense that we're not just a derivative society. We don't, as John Howard thinks, just derive from Britain. You know, we don't. We know he's just said the other day that curriculum's left out all of British history. You know, well, Australian history isn't just British history extended. You know, we actually did invent. We are experimenters, and I would want to emphasise that.
So just quickly, is it best probably to understand Anzac Day as within the sphere of transnational history rather than Australian national history then?
Well, I mean, I certainly think it's much more interesting. I mean, I think it's really interesting, the invasion of the Ottoman Empire in 1915. And the more you read about that and the way that, you know, you had four empires, basically, you know, Germans and Ottomans on the one side and British and French and of course Russians. I mean, it's really interesting to see where the Anzacs scrabbling up the hills, you know, what they were doing there as forces invading the Ottoman Empire. And the fact that it was a Muslim state, I think, is also really interesting. So, yeah, I think world history adds enormous interest.
May I ask, do you also accept that it's not a militaristic commemoration? I mean, when I'm in France on the 14th of July, up and down the Champs-Elysees are tanks and people marching and planes overhead, and it's breastplate. You see the May Day military things in Russia, same sort of thing. Whereas ours, it's not driven by that. There's no actual military breastplate. How good were we? It's a sad day of commemoration, and it started out for the Anzacs, and it's moved on. So that's one thing, to honour the fallen, the people that died. And it's also to honour those who served, and it also brings the community together on one day. But it's not a militaristic day.
Wars are about the military. I mean, you can't ignore.
But we know. No. But we know. Okay, but it's not. There's also militarism. You know, we know the meaning of militarism, and it's not. It is a sad commemorative day. It's not a breastbeating militaristic day.
It's saying military experience is our key experience as a nation, and I don't think that's true.
It's saying it was one of our key experiences, I think.
Well,
Okay, we'll take the next question from over here.
I am a high school history teacher, so I know what's happening there with the John Howard's curriculum, where anything that is not a wartime curriculum is labelled. There's a unit that's actually called Australia Between the Wars. So apparently we're either war or we're between war, and that's it. However, what I wanted to ask about is working in schools that are very multicultural and with a quarter of Australians not born in Australia these days. I'm wondering if any of you believe that Anzac Day can in some way be an exclusive occasion where it is excluding the history of the other people who are here, who, while Peter talks about Anzac Day bringing people together, actually there are many people who perhaps may not feel part of that, having perhaps been on the opposition at the time.
And without breaching board, I don't know if that's working, without breaching board confidentiality or anything like that at ACAB. So we're looking at how we're going to spend money for the commemoration of centenary from 1914 to 1918. That has been a serious issue. And there was a report that was done, and you may remember the hell of a hullabaloo, because the report said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but it can't be, Anzac Day cannot be a white rump, for the white rump of Australia. It has got to be absolutely inclusionary. And it was fascinating, because within this report, it was like, 80 pages long, and there was one sentence that had multiculturalism and Anzac Day in the same sentence. And the Telegraph went berserk. And Talkback went berserk, and how dare you, political correctness and the rest of it. But I believe that absolutely we're certainly doing this, we're making sure that it is as inclusionary as possible. So there's a great focus in making sure that Australians from all stripes, coming from all parts of the world, of all ethnicities, of all religions, feel included, not excluded on Anzac Day. And if Anzac Day were to remain sort of a celebration of white Australia, or to try to be a celebration of white Australia, it will die, and it'll deserve to die.
Can I just say something? Yes, I think, as I mentioned in my talk, inclusion is one of the strategies of the commemorationists, of course, precisely because an obvious criticism. I mean, first of all, Anzac Day itself in Gallipoli, of course, was exclusive in that women didn't serve in the military, which is another thing about military experience being definitive. It's a masculine experience. And secondly, Indigenous people were actually excluded from enlistment in World War I. And of course, a response to that now is to make it as inclusive as possible and to identify every single group, as I said, including animals now, who all participated. But I think that robs it of history, because in fact, you're right. It's a war in which there were two sides, if not three or four. I mean, the Russian Revolution, etc. And I think the great interest in that is to actually look at the war in historical terms, rather than to say we were all there together,
Okay, but there were Indigenous people that served in the First World War.
There were, but only by, only because they got through, or they weren't seen to be Indigenous. They were formally excluded.
And there were certainly many women that served in the Second World War, among whom was my mother, and the other one was Nancy, another obvious one, Nancy Wake. The service of Australian women is widely celebrated.
I know, I was talking about Gallipoli and World War I.
Sure, but Anzac, my point is, I'm not just talking about Gallipoli, that Anzac Day is something that encompasses and honours all who served in all Australian wars.
There's one more interesting point about inclusion, I think, to make, which is it's one thing to say to people, in some ways what you're saying to people is you're welcome to be included in this. It's another for people of all backgrounds to feel intrinsically that it is their day. And there's something written about that very recently, quite interestingly, I think, by Tim Soutphommasane, who's a young Australian political philosopher of I think Lao Cambodian background, saying from his point of view, he does feel that Anzac Day belongs to him in that way. But I think it would be an interesting question to ask, to find out, no matter whether this inclusion is from people's desire to be included or a political imperative to make sure that it's as broadly supported as possible. Anyway, enough from me.
I find it quite interesting that we make so much of the First World War, as we call it, as though the war was fought between Britain, Germany and France, whereas in fact the little war was between Austria and Eastern Balkans. And it's only because of minute ways of people trying to help each other that Russia came in, which then brought Germany in to help Austria, and that brought France in, and because Germany went through Belgium, that brought Britain in. So Britain and France were actually add-on people, And it's most interesting that they are the ones that set about trying to start this business of first depriving them in 1913 of equipment, but then deciding that they were going to knock these Austrians out of the way. But more importantly, they used the war with the idea that early Serbia and the Mesopotamia was going to be divided up as colonies for France and Britain, which is now the cause of practically all the problem in the Middle East. So shouldn't the day be called something like Colonial Interference in Military Politics Day, CIMP?
Well, we could always get on to Afghanistan if it hadn't already been dealt with today. We'll take the question from here.
If war commemoration is looking at the role of pets and animals, etc., in past wars, why not include in the commemoration of the invasion wars against Aboriginal people in this country? Or, with all due respect to everybody here, I'm going to use the C word, but what about class war in this country, which has given us that 8-hour working day and other civil conflicts? Why are these not seen as important conflicts to commemorate?
Sure.
Can I just say one thing on the pet thing? I mean, with great respect, it's a clever and it's a funny line.
No, it's fact.
But look, okay, maybe it's a fact in one line in one report, but there's not serious money going towards commemorating pets. I mean, it's not. I see the papers. I sit in the councils. It's not a serious thing. Sorry, you go.
You should go to the DVA website. It's all set out there, and I actually invite all of you to do that too. I mean, it's really interesting. I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that I'm trying to get us all to remember is the class war, in a way. I mean, that many people gave their lives, if you like, and gave their service to the nation in the cause of social justice, in the cause of a minimum wage, in the cause of an 8-hour day. And I think it'd be really fantastic if all their names were on nominal rolls, that the families could all look up and say, I'm really proud of, great-grandfather Percy, who served in those trade unions and won us the 44-hour week or something. I mean, wouldn't that be fabulous?
But in the real world, we're talking in the real world. Do you really think that if you set up a museum for such and such, for all of those things, the social justice, I totally agree, and it's all admirable, but in the real world you're going to have people that will go, and actually there needs to be a story that people will get excited by. And whereas First Gallipoli is an appalling story, but it's a gripping story, and it's a story that a lot of people across Australia know. So, in the real world, you actually think you could get an institution in Canberra and
there is one already, the Museum of Australian Democracy.
Sure, but the thing on the wall, what we're talking about, saying it's all equal and that, in the real world, the story to get people through the gates has got to grip people.
I think there's a lot of illusion about it's only the story that grips people. What I was trying to say is that some stories have more power behind them than others, and they clearly have discursive power, but they also have material power, they have financial power, they have the power of national leaders telling the story. And I mean, I know lots and lots of people who can tell good stories, and actually one of the things about Australian history, it's not, as John Howard said, a choice between themes and a stew of themes and issues and good old story and narrative. It's a choice of which stories do we want to tell in Australian
and which
history.
stories do they want to buy?
Well, but how can they buy them if they're not already actually published?
But I'm somebody I am somebody that tells stories for a living, and I've just done Eureka Stockade, and I'm looking now at what I'm going to spend the next year or two of my life doing. And so I look at and I talk to people all the time, suggestions of what stories do people want to hear. So I make those decisions, but I'm not a part of a malevolent force shoving it down the Australian throat. It is a sense of the stories that people want to hear.
Peter, because a lot of your work are those wonderful biographical stories of extraordinary lives of different kinds, stories of these kinds of events in war. Who are your readers?
Who are the readers? People that like Australian history, for a start. I love Australian history. And so I've been totally absorbed in the last year or two with Eureka Stockade. It's a killer story. It's a wonderful story, and there's a lot to admire in it. I think that it's absolutely ground zero for multiculturalism. It's absolutely ground zero for those of us who believe in a republic. I started out writing the book thinking this book started because I was in Ausflag meeting, and we're looking at all these submissions of flags, most of which have kangaroos and boomerangs, and thinking my point in that I thinking it's a pity we don't have a Betsy Ross and a story like that, and that started me thinking about the Eureka flag. The problem with the Eureka flag is that it's too associated on the one hand with the far left, with the unions, and it's too associated with those at Cronulla Beach on the right, and the racist redneck nutters who put it as a flag of white supremacy. And by the end of the book, I reckon actually that is our symbol. So that is a symbol that Australia can be proud of. It's a story that Australia can be proud of. But I totally concur with Marilyn. It would be great to have an Independence Day. How old are we?
Pretty grown up, I think. This gentleman here.
Thank you. This is strictly a question for Professor Lake because it's about sport. Partly.
What a whiff.
Look, I was brought up in the Anzac tradition. We used to plant crosses on the lawns of my father's church. We went to school and had special celebrations, and in spite of the diatribes of the Returned Services Association, it was one of New Zealand's important days and important things to remember. But I looked at, with horror, at the transmogrification of Anzac Day that occurred during the Howard years. And at the same time, it seemed to me there was a transmogrification of the way people viewed sport. Suddenly it became a matter of great jingoistic importance that Australia should win, and should win at all costs, that everybody should support the Australian team, and if foreigners who came to Australia should support a different team, they were disloyal and to be suspected and somehow disgraceful.
What sport particularly?
At the same time, we got this stuff about Australian values and taking a test in relation to becoming an Australian. And so it became important not to just learn things about democracy and so on, which I accept, but that we learn about far lap and a number of other things in that were quite ridiculous. So my question, sorry to make such a long speech at the start, my question is to Professor Lake, were these things not connected? Were they not part of a deliberate changing of the story in Australia? And was they rather than an automatic and sort of person-driven uprising of delight in Australia or something?
Yeah.
The source of the change in the numbers at Anzac Day and so on.
Yeah. Actually, thanks for that question. In fact, I don't want to promote our book, What's Wrong with Anzac, but one of the chapters in that was written by Mark McKenna, which is an analysis of the shifting attitudes to and commemoration of Anzac Day itself, which is a really good chapter in terms of giving a quite detailed historical analysis of that, because to answer your question, you would need to look quite closely. One general point I'd make, though, I did start to think when John Howard, who in fact was extremely interested and still is, of course, in history. He's much more interested in history, as a subject than either Julia Gillard or Rudd. But he was so interested in history, but I did think at the time that his engagement with military history and Anzac and that stuff came out of his nationalism, if you like. He was a great nationalist. And I think that's where the sporting stuff has come from as well. As you say, we've become a much more belligerently, actually, nationalist country, I think, than we used to be. And I, for one, am a bit worried about that. I always think of Nugget Coombs, that great Commonwealth bureaucrat, and he said about being Australian, he said, I don't think it's appropriate to say I'm proud of being Australian, but I would say I enjoy being Australian. And I think it's a lovely phrase, because it doesn't have that belligerently nationalistic quality that both our discussion of the Olympics as well as our discussion of Anzac Day has.
Peter?
I tend to agree with what you just said.
Yeah. You're not going to... I thought we could at least get something going on belligerent nationalism.
What's the book? What's the title you want me to do?
Don't.
Don't what?
Come on, we're not
I
going to
think
be
that went straight
that
over my head, luckily I didn't get it.
Over to you.
I'd like to pick up on the theme of the history teacher and the gentleman just before me. I happened to mention to a friend of mine in Perth that I was coming to this talk today. He is first-generation Australian from Croatian descent, and he said to me that he didn't ever get Anzac Day because there was never a personal connection. And I wonder whether part of what you've described, 96 onwards, is part of an attempt to homogenise our understanding of what it means to be Australian, especially in the light of the fact that you could argue that a large percentage of those people that died for Australia were of Anglo-Saxon descent. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right in terms of it being quite a systematic education campaign. I mean, that's really what it was. It was deliberately designed to educate the Australian community about the meaning of Anzac and the making of the nation. What you said about not having a personal connection is also really interesting because, as Peter did earlier, it's very common for when people say write on blogs or write to the paper or do online stuff or whatever, when they enter a debate about these issues, they often preface what they say with, as someone who had a great-grandfather who served in blah and a grandfather in the Second World War, I mean, people now, these days often preface as if it's a sort of right to speak that you had people who served in the military. And I find that actually a bit disturbing too, because one of the things about World War I is it divided the population between those who went and those who, the stay-at-homes, as they were stigmatised with white feathers, you know. So I wouldn't like to see our community divided between those who had relatives who served and, you know, those who didn't.
It's legitimate, however, to be proud of the fact that you did have...
Yeah, but you don't need to preface what you say by saying you had people there as if...
Thanks, I'm very happy with the way I prefaced my speech.
Well, I think that was one... That's a very interesting question, because I think it's, you know, obviously very moving to hear you talk about that familial connection and being taken by your parents and really engaging with it on those grounds. And those of us who don't have the experience, have a feeling of not being connected to it, perhaps. And it goes to the points that you've both raised. Marilyn's point about originally, that it was originally about... there's a difference between the commemoration of the service and death of individuals and this broader national thing. And I mean, in some ways, the extension of that argument goes to the conversation about once the people who served at Anzac have all died, is this something that should continue? And those arguments about what about the children and grandchildren of people who served. And so I think this question about the relationship of individual people who did actually serve is a very relevant one, and I think to some extent people who bring that up are staking their claim to be in the conversation, particularly because there has been this discussion about, you know, if you didn't serve yourself, if it was your father and grandfather, that view of the RSL.
Or grandmother.
What do you think about the question of grandmother? Thank you. What do you think about, you know, what do you think about the argument that once the people who served themselves have died, that there's something that goes out of that celebration?
Well, we've lost the last First World War digger, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, and the Second World War diggers. I mean, I went to the last stand of the 2nd 13th Battalion. It was a very moving thing. There were 11 men, and they said, this is our last time together, and they've never been able to meet again because they just can't get a quorum. But we in our family, there's my father's medals and my mother's medals, and we've got 6 children. We discussed, should my parents' grandchildren wear the medals in the parade? My view is no, they didn't serve. But, you know, the Anzac Day goes on because to honour those who do serve. And they are an admirable group of people that do serve. And we have been on the right side of most wars. And even when we're on the, you know, even when we're in wars like Iraq, which I bitterly disagreed with, I still honour those who serve. It's a very brave, courageous thing they do. And the vast majority have served with great honour. And so when you're... Thank you. And I'm noting that's a small smattering of applause rather than thunderous applause.
Come on.
That's all right. Anyway,
Okay, we'll take these last 2 questions. We've got 2-ish minutes before we finish, so we'll go over here and then here.
Sorry, should we move the focus of Anzac Day from the national story and the national values to the actual sacrifices by the diggers and by the women that were served? How could we do this, and would this somehow affect the current nationalistic tone of Anzac Day?
In other words, in a way, can we go backwards? You know, can we go back to commemorating the individual sacrifice, which is what used to be done? I mean, I personally, as I said, I think, of course, we should commemorate their service to the nation, just as we should commemorate the service of a whole lot of other people in all walks of life to the nation, by the way, you know, whether it's in education or health or whatever. Of course, we should commemorate that, but I don't think we should confuse that that's how our nation was built. You know, I think that's a wrong, historically distorted story. So I think, yes, we should distinguish, you know. And in fact, that's happening now, because you know how it's going to change is that because for those 15 years, DVA held sway with its education. It was the only agency that sent out education materials to all schools across Australia because, of course, as you know, education is traditionally the province of the states. It's the states that decided school curricula until now. Now that there's going to be a national history curriculum, that's for the first time is going to, as it were, complement or replace DVA in instructing us, you know, in what our national history is. And it's interesting that no one seems to have picked up on this much, but I think it's extremely interesting that the curriculum in the senior levels, when it looks at Australian history in the 20th century, the date it starts at is actually 1916, the year after Gallipoli, which no one's sort of noticed that yet, but it might become quite controversial because it seemingly deliberately, you know, leaves Gallipoli in the past and stuff. And 1916 it sees as a significant year, by the way, in Australian history because it's the conscription referendum, which of course divided the Australian population bitterly, which made World War I such a bitter experience, such a divisive experience.
Any comment?
I want to finish on that line. That, I mean, we could all wish there were no wars and there were no needs for soldiers. I love the scene in Jack Nicholson, Few Good Men. You know the thing, we live in a world that has walls, those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You know the scene. I mean, I say we do live in a war that has walls. Those walls do have to be guarded by men and women with guns. Who's going to do it? You, Marilyn? Me? No. There are people that are out there. We do need a defence. Let me finish, if I may. We do need a defence force. We have an honourable defence force, and I do honour those who serve, and I honour those who fell, and I think it right and proper. Not that it is Anzac Day to the exclusion of all other things, but we have an honourable military tradition in this country, and Anzac Day, by and large, is a good community thing that brings us all together. I don't think there are dark, malevolent forces manoeuvring the Australian mind. I think we as a people, the debate, the talk that we're having now, we talk about it, we work out what are the stories that resonate most with us, but I'm back with you. I agree, we want an Independence Day as well. Thank you.
We've got one. We do just have one more question.
My daughter used to be in the school band, and they regularly used to go out and play for, Ashfield RSL to celebrate Sandakan Day. They had a really bad experience where after they played, the RSL representatives gave a talk basically saying that Japanese were horrible, disgusting people, and one of the girls in the band was Japanese who cried. I don't see these sort of celebrations as bringing our community together. Shouldn't we be embracing all the people who live in Australia and not kind of reflecting on the battles of the past?
I bow to no one in my passion for multicultural Australia. I'm sorry that happened to that Japanese girl. I don't think it's representative of what happens by and large.
Marilyn. A final comment.
No, I don't really have a final comment. I mean, I think that's a sad, terrible story. I agree about divisiveness.
Well, I think it's very interesting to consider about the fact of all the wars that Australians have fought in. Are there anywhere we haven't fought against people who, now are
live here?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's a constant challenge with these issues. Thank you so much to our wonderful discussants, Peter Fitzsimons, Marilyn Lake.
Thank you.
I'm hoping that they will join us in the foyer to sign copies of their books now. Thank you to you for coming along and engaging in this conversation. Last few minutes of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. If you're lucky enough to have tickets to our final event, How to Solve the World's Problems, I'll see you there. Otherwise, next year. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.